Hello everyone and welcome to our Year in Review Regional Roundtable series, brought to you by the Employment Law Alliance, the largest network of labor and employment lawyers from the best law firms around the globe. I'm your host, Philippe Durand, partner with Auguste Debouzy in France. The ELA Global Employment Law Year in Review series is classically our most popular series of the year, focusing on the most impactful regulations of the past year and forecasting what employers can expect in the current year. This is a good opportunity for our listeners, HR specialists, managers, or lawyers to pause for a few minutes and think about major issues in 2022 and the year to come. Today, we are connecting with 4 ELA member firms for Europe's Nordic region. Joining us on the program are Fredrik Dahl. Fredrik is a partner with Vinger in Sweden. Tina Brøgger Sørensen, she is a partner with Plesner in Denmark. Tomi Kanpainen, a partner with Castrén and Snellman in Finland. And Fredrik Punsvik, we have 2 Fredriks on the program today. Fredrik Punsvik, who is a senior associate with Selmer in Norway. Tina, Tomi, Fredrik, and Fredrik, thank you for joining today our Year in Review Roundtable. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Doing fine?
All good. Happy to join the talk.
Thank you, Philip. Same here. Great to join the program and discussion.
Excellent. So now we are ready to go. I would like to start with the general question we would ask in this kind of program. And I would like to start maybe with you, Tina, if you don't mind. What would be, in your view, or what were, I should say, the most significant legal changes in 2022 that impacted employers? And if I start with you, Tina, let's talk then about Denmark. What would be those major changes in 2022 in Denmark?
Well, just like all other EU member states, Denmark has been preparing for the implementation of the EU directive on work-life balance for parents and carers. This directive has been implemented in Denmark in June 2022 with effect in relation to children born on 2nd August in 2022 and later. This legislation has given reason for an extensive public debate in Denmark, as it is considered as an intervention in parents' free right to decide on this topic. The Danish Parliament has only made a minimum implementation of this directive, as we already had 2 weeks of earmarked maternity-paternity leave following the birth of a child. This means that parents only have to get used to 9 more weeks of parental leave being earmarked. It is still left to the labor market parties to agree on any additional rights to earmark parental leave. Then another very essential topic is age discrimination. I would rather say as always. As of 1st of July 2022, the Danish Act on the Prohibition of Discrimination was amended. It is no longer lawful to ask about a job applicant's age during a recruitment process. The new provision aims to help prevent screening based on the age of job applicants. On the topic of age discrimination, the large Danish trade union, the Union of Commercial and Clerical Employees, has been involved in a 11-year-old court case, and this case relates to the organization's statutory provision that only members of the union who have reached the age of more than 60 can run for election as president of the union. In 2022, the European Court of Justice found that such a provision falls within the scope of the Equal Treatment Directive, and we were to some extent surprised about it. Afterwards, it was also concluded that the age restriction was considered as a violation of the directive, even though it is not considered as applying in an employment relationship, but certain position of trust. And this may, of course, also have an impact on the other EU member states on such matters.
Excellent. The thing that strikes me is the age discrimination, this new rule you talked about, which I personally find a bit harsh, but that's a personal point of view. Turning to Finland maybe, and Tomi, I would ask you the same question. Major legal changes in Finland for 2022.
Thank you, Philip. For Finland, I see that we had 3 main legal changes in the field of employment during 2022. First of all, we had the new cooperation law that entered into force in the beginning of the year that regulates the mass redundancy process in Finland. In a nutshell, you could say that the redundancy process itself remained the same with some minor changes, but the employers within the scope of the Act are now obliged to draw up more practical and frequently updated development plan for the workplace. Further, as a main rule, they have to carry out also the dialogue with the personnel 4 times per year. Earlier, these obligations were not this active, broad, and frequent, so the change has been quite essential from the admin side and consultation side with the personnel. Second change related to the non-compete agreements here in Finland, because they changed so that the employer will always have to pay compensation for the non-compete agreement that is valid post-employment. Basically, nowadays, the amount of compensation varies between 40 to 60% of the employee's salary, and the amount of compensation depends on the duration of the restriction. Based on the reform, the employer has also the right to terminate the non-compete restrictions using a notice period that is at least 1/3 of the restriction period. But it's worth noting that the employer can't terminate non-compete clause after the employee has resigned. Basically, if companies haven't reviewed their non-compete agreements in Finland during the last year, I think now it's good time to do that. And the last thing to mention is that also Finland has implemented EU directive on whistleblowing, and the new regulation came into force in the beginning of 2023. So I would raise these 3 questions.
Thank you, Tommy. Excellent to have those practical tips you were talking about, particularly on the non-compete. Turning maybe now to Sweden and you, Fredrik, same question for you for Sweden in 2022. What would you have to say?
It's been the most exciting year for a very, very long time in Sweden for employment lawyers. We finally made amendments to the Employment Protection Act for the first time in 40 years. And we have now changed the reasons or the legal grounds for termination referring to the employee's behavior. The aim is that it should be easier to terminate people due to performance or behavior. It's a change of the language in the Employment Protection Act, and let's see when it comes to the courts if it will have a practical effect. But we should have less focus on the employee's interest to remain in employment and more focus on whether a breach of the obligations under the employment contract have taken place. At least sort of an ambition to make it easier. We have changed a little bit the rules when we make redundancies. As you might know, we need to observe a very strict seniority rule in Sweden, last in, first out. Now we are able to exempt 3 employees from that list. Maybe one of the most major changes is that if you should terminate an employee for any reason, if the employee would go to court before the employee remained in employment during the entire court procedure, which made it almost financially impossible to actually go to court and see the court's view because the court procedure takes 2 years. That has now changed, so the employment will expire at the end of the notice period, so we don't have to finance the employee's dispute in court. And finally, we have amended the rules for fixed-term contracts, which has now, we can only do that for 12 months, which is a very short period of time. And the employees on fixed-term contracts will have a strengthened right to be employed until further notice. So major changes, you need to watch out when you sort of enter into new processes of terminating or having poor performance plans, because there are other aspects to take into consideration as from 1st of October last year.
Very good. Certainly major changes, as you said, and certainly big year in Sweden from an employment law perspective. Good to know. The same question I would like to turn now to Fredrik, the other Fredrik Punsvik for Norway. So what would be your views on those legal changes you would have witnessed in Norway for 2022?
Thank you, Philip. There are several changes in the employment law area that are currently taking place in Norway. and it can actually be challenging to have a complete overview of all of them. I would like to highlight two matters in particular. Firstly, we are facing major changes in the rules that apply to hiring labor from staffing companies. The specific changes are quite technical, and there is also a transitional period until 1st April this year. But roughly speaking, we can say that staffing companies are completely banned from hiring out labor to construction companies in the wider Oslo region. Also, one of the most used provisions for hiring temporary labor from staffing companies is removed. And this affects the businesses across the country, meaning that an undertaking can only hire temporary workers from staffing companies if it is as a stand-in for a named employee on leave. And this differs very much from before, where staffing companies would be used as source for temporary labor, for example, in time-limited projects. The second legal change I would like to highlight is that Parliament has decided to introduce what they call a full-time norm, which is basically a view that full-time jobs shall be the main rule at Norwegian workplaces. And you could say that this has been a general rule for a long time already, but now follows some new material and procedural rules that every employer must consider. Among them is the duty on the employer to assess and document in writing the need for each individual part-time employment in the undertaking. And further, the employer must consult with the local employee representatives and allow them to comment on the assessment. So it will be exciting to see how these changes will develop in the years ahead of us.
Well, Fredrik, certainly this is going into a global direction of more restrictions from an employer's point of view. So that's certainly useful to know. In this series, you may know that we like to focus as well on leadership or government changes in your respective countries. So I would like, maybe, Tommy, you could start for Finland. I would like to hear what you would have to say about leadership and government changes, for example, in Finland, if any. Have you seen these kind of changes impact your jurisdiction over the past year? And what changes would you be anticipating for 2023? Tommy, let's start with you.
Thank you, Philip. This is a good question. And we are actually facing parliamentary election this spring, so 2023 spring. And we are having interesting times ahead to see how the election goes and who or which parties are going to form the new government. But for the year 2022, I would like to mention that the biggest impact in Finland, I think, was created by the collective agreement related salary increases to the public healthcare sector, if you consider impacts of the country or the business field. And this is due to the fact that the nursing staff received significant pay raise for the coming years. And now this has caused similar pressure to the private sector salary negotiations. And at the moment, we are close to a strike wave in many key sectors in Finland, such as retail, logistics, and transportation and harbors. At the moment, it's very interesting to see if all these strikes will take place during the February and March, and how the situation will develop over the next weeks and months. And especially when we have the parliamentary elections coming, these things might be even connected. And as I said, for the spring, we have the election coming, and at least based on the current estimates, the right-wing party named National Coalition may have a strong position in the coming elections because they haven't had any governmental responsibility or government responsibility during the last 4 years.
Good to know. So we will watch for that in addition to the other topics you just mentioned, Tommy. Now I would like to hear what you would have to say, Tina, on the same subject matter, leadership, government changes you would anticipate for Denmark.
Yeah. On 1st of November 2022, we actually had the general election to the Danish parliament. Mette Frederiksen from the Social Democratic Party has been re-elected as our prime minister. However, the very significant and very unusual change is that the government now consists of three parties across the political center line. Our government, having the legislative majority, now consists of the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the new Liberal Party, the Moderates, which is founded by our former Prime Minister. It is expected right now that the new government will pursue a more liberal policy, which of course may benefit Danish employers. However, the Social Democrats still hold the posts of Minister of Employment and the Minister of Industry, Business and Financial Affairs. So we will of course have to see if it will end as expected. This new government has already faced a huge negative reaction on their labor market policy. This is due to their political proposal to abolish the public holiday, General Prayer Day. The reason for this political proposal is, amongst a lot, due to the economical crisis after Corona, the war in Ukraine, etc. This bill has just been introduced in Parliament, and this is right before the labor market parties are starting up their negotiations on the collective bargaining agreements in the private sector. The trade unions have been furious because, of course, they think that this is a topic that relies to them to discuss. And the largest and most influential confederation of trade unions in Denmark, it's called FH, has gone as far as to call for a referendum on the proposal from our government. So this is rather tense right now.
Obviously, some tensions may be to be expected. You didn't say that this would go as far as striking, as Tomi was talking about for Finland, but certainly something to be checked.
Definitely might end like that with strikes, yeah.
Now, I would like you to suggest that we move to Norway, and you, Fredrik, same question for you. Any changes in leadership, government changes in your country?
Well, we had a change of government in 2021 after 8 years with a right-wing government. Now a minority coalition led by the Labour Party is heading the government. Immediately after taking up office, the government stated a desire to strengthen permanent positions and full-time employment as the main rule in Norway. Further, they have been promoting closer cooperation with the unions. And over the past year, we are definitely beginning to see the results of this as we see changes in law at a rapid pace. I've already mentioned 2 of those, but we also know that there is more to come. The government's latest proposal regards an extension of employee rights within a group of companies in the event of a redundancy. This includes that the employer's obligation to offer other suitable work prior to dismissal should also apply to the other companies within the same group as the employer company. And this, of course, raised some difficult questions across various and independent entities. So it will be exciting to see how it ends.
Thank you, Fredrik. Again, a few topics to watch. So let's close this question about government changes or leadership changes with Sweden and you, the other, Fredrik, last but not least. How about your own jurisdiction?
We have a new government in Sweden since October last year. Right-wing government, extremely weak, having just small majority in the parliament. We do not expect that they will do anything groundbreaking regarding employment law legislation, since we just sort of entered into force the changes in the Employment Protection Act. And all the Swedish collective bargaining agreements are up for renegotiation during March and April. And normally the government sits very, very still when the parties on the labor market shall renegotiate the collective bargaining agreement. And the government is entirely occupied by getting Sweden into NATO. So labor law will not be the focus for the government.
Very good. So major changes last year, pretty quiet. That's your forecast for next year in Sweden as far as employment law is concerned. Thanks. Now, moving to the next topic, home office. That's the next topic I would like to discuss with you guys today. Remote working, of course, has been a hot topic following Corona, COVID crisis, of course. And what I would like to hear from you, and we could start with Norway and you, Fredrik. What I would like to hear from you is actually, how would you view remote working in your respective jurisdiction? How does your national law or courts tackle hybrid working from home, return to the office, cross-border remote work, et cetera, We see that a lot. I've had many clients, for example, calling me saying that right after COVID-19, I realized that I had one person who moved to France, supposedly because of COVID-19. The person doesn't want to go back, which I think is a good idea to live in our great country, by the way. But how are we going to face that from a legal point of view? So these are the questions I would like to discuss with you. And let's start again, as I said, with you, Fredrik, in Norway.
Thank you, Philippe. Last year, we got a more up-to-date set of regulations regarding work from home, taking into consideration the digital development in the work life the last 20 years. And I think now with this new regulation, the formal requirements should be very clear for most employers in Norway, as long as they know about it. To keep it short, a written agreement must be drawn up, and this agreement must contain regulation regarding working hours, duration of the work from home agreement, termination rights, etc. I think we can say in general that the extent of remote work is significantly greater now than pre-COVID. I believe white-collar workers are allowed some degree of flexibility at most workplaces nowadays. But as for the future development on this area, I believe we are only in the starting bit, because employers are still learning by doing. They gain more experience with handling employees working from home. There are several exciting problems to be dealt with in the future. For example, we see that some employers have troubles providing sufficient follow-up on identified underperformers who works from home. And of course, it would say it is easier to provide guidance when you're located at the office and have the possibility to have continuously dialogue during the day. It is way more difficult to do that by the help of Zoom or Teams.
That makes sense. And I guess most jurisdictions would feel the same about the very last issue you were talking about. How about Sweden, Fredrik? What would you say for home office remote working in your jurisdiction?
We actually had an initiative from the government 20 years ago to increase the possibilities to work from home. So we already had regulation on those topics, especially when we talk about the work environmental responsibility for the employers having employees at home. It wasn't used to a great extent, and now we see that people are working from home in a much more greater extent than before COVID. And I would say that the standard program for all employers, at least here in Stockholm, would be 3 days in the office, 2 days from home. That's the absolute standard. What we see, though, is that people are expecting, or employees are expecting, that they can work from France or Canary Islands or south of Spain instead of being in Sweden. So many work from home policies have now been updated to say that work from home, the home must be within the Swedish jurisdiction, because this causes not only employment law issues, but tax issues that will affect not only the employee, but also the employer. And employers are, at least not yet, prepared to take those tax effects into consideration. So they want their employees to work in Sweden, at least. So that is the issues we're fighting with right now in Sweden.
Very good. 3 and 2 is pretty standard as well in France. And this issue about what is remote work, does that include beaches in the Canary Islands, for example, or not, is something I saw. And same question with clients. We need to change policies. Although in your example, you could also be working from a beach in Sweden. There will be no tax issue. But certainly, to be more serious, that raises quite a few income tax and social security taxes issues when people start moving around without telling you and leaving the country to work abroad without telling you. That can lead to some potential problem. Finland, Tommy, what would be your views on that topic of remote work?
Thanks, Philip. Based on my observations, I would say that most of the Finnish companies have already updated their remote working policies within the last 2 years, and they are mainly fine-tuning the policies at the moment. But as Fredrik mentioned, for Sweden, I think we have similar discussions and development around the flexibility. So basically, you can freely decide where you work within the Finnish borders, but you shouldn't allow the employees to decide their location freely, because then there might be tax and social security issues at the later stage. Further, I would say that flexible working is very common in businesses where it's possible, because hiring and retaining top talent requires flexible working conditions. But on the other hand, we can easily see that companies try to encourage people to return to the office and spend more time there to have staff turnover rate reduced, and also to improve working culture after several COVID years. And perhaps one note for this topic is that in the future, employers need to apply for an A1 certificate regarding the social security, even for short business trips from Finland to abroad, because the number of people working abroad has increased. And by clarifying these guidelines, the authorities try to limit the number of cases where the question of applicable social security country and law may come up as a question retrospectively. So basically, we already have authority guidelines also for this topic.
It will be good to see how this will really change in Finland in 2022, and we can already say that we will most likely meet again and talk about that in a year from now. Denmark, and Tina, you'll be the last one on the list to talk to us about remote work. How would you describe this for Denmark?
Quite similar like in the other countries. And actually, the Danish Authority for Danish Statistics has analyzed the numbers of employees working from home. The number shows that employees working in Denmark in general have continued to work remote as they have been used to during the pandemic. Remote work clearly seems to have become a more integral part of everyday life for many employees. They are getting used to virtual meetings with colleagues as well as business partners. In consequence, new health and safety rules on teleworking have entered into force during 2022. These rules have been made more up to date and take account to the fact that more employees are working from home. And with these new rules, the special working environment requirements in the Screen Executive also will apply. When screen work at the home workplace is carried out regularly and for more than 2 days a week as an average over a period of 1 month. So it's very important that the employer follows up with how many days the employees are actually going to work home. It includes requirements in relation to, for instance, the screen, the work chair, a desktop. It also includes requirements regarding variation in work and breaks. And finally, it also contains requirements for eye examinations and screen glasses. So it's rather detailed. And just like Fredrik Dahl mentioned with Sweden and Tommy regarding Finland, there are definitely also tax issues to take into consideration when there's a cross-border issue. And as you might know, Denmark is quite close to Sweden. So we have a lot of people working from home in Sweden for a Danish employer, and it has huge impact on social contributions and so forth. So that's similar like in the other countries.
Thank you, Tina, for that and for Denmark. As you said, we do see similarities in terms of topics and concerns throughout the 4 Nordic countries and with other jurisdictions. I'm sure that our listeners will pick that up. I would like now to close our discussion with a final question I will have for you. And let's start, for example, with Norway. And you, Fredrik. Final question in this series is pretty standard. What would be your predictions for the year to come, for 2023, regarding employment law updates or changes that you would anticipate and that might have a significant impact on HR specialists or employers in your respective jurisdictions? So for Norway, Fredrik, what would you answer to that question?
That's a good question. I am especially excited to see how the changes of rules that apply to the hiring of labor from staffing companies will develop in practice. We expect that the EFTA Surveillance Authority will take a closer look at the new regulation, but until further, we must deal with what we got. Also, it will be exciting to see if the government's proposal to strengthen the employees' rights across group companies will be adopted. This is a potential game changer for many employers who deals with redundancy, and it will entail additional work and assessments for those involved. And speaking of redundancies, we are currently involved in several downsizing or redundancy projects. And in my experience, for the last few months, I believe that we have seen more disputes along these lines than what we had seen before. That is due to the simple fact that the economy is tougher, and therefore employees are more willing to put up a fight to keep their existing jobs. There are exciting times ahead of us, and I'm thrilled to see that employment law plays such a great role.
Thank you for that. Certainly exciting. Denmark and Tina, what kind of changes would you anticipate in your crystal ball?
Well, first of all, right now, the negotiations of collective bargaining agreements in the private sector have already begun and will run throughout the next couple of months. The results will affect a very large part of the companies in the private sector for expectedly the next 3 years. And so at present, this is clearly the hot topic in Danish employment and labor law. If a result is not achieved between the labor market parties, or if the members of the trade unions reject the results, there is a risk of major conflict. This will entail that a large part of the labor market will be brought to a standstill. And going back to the public debate regarding the government's proposal on general prayer day is expected to influence the negotiations, or at least the employees' motivation to vote yes to the results of the negotiations. If the employees do not consider themselves as adequately compensated, this could very well lead to their rejection of the results. And then we have all this strike issue as discussed previously. Then I noted that in Finland, you have just implemented the whistleblower directive. Actually, Denmark was very much ahead of time because in December 2021, it was implemented for all of the large companies in Denmark with 250 employees or more. But this year, medium-sized companies with 50 to 249 employees, they must establish a whistleblower scheme no later than December this year. And this will, of course, affect a lot of companies towards the end of 2023 and going forward. We have the EU directive on transparent and predictable working conditions that has still not been implemented in Denmark, although the deadline was in August 2022. And this is for various political reasons. So we are slightly delayed here, and we will have to wait and see. But the implementation will be reflected in a new Danish Act on employment contracts and certain employment terms. And the Act will introduce a more extensive obligation to inform employees about their employment terms and conditions and introduce certain minimum rights. So we clearly expect to be busy on this topic as well in 2023.
Thank you for that, Tina. I think that your comment on whistleblowing was quite useful because, unlike what some people would think, more medium-sized companies, 50 to 249, are certainly concerned by whistleblowing, even though sometimes it's a different time frame for them, which will come soon in Denmark, because as you said, you were pretty quick to implement the directive. How about Sweden, Fredrik? What would you forecast for your jurisdiction in 2023?
What we have to watch out for in this coming year is, as in Denmark, the renegotiation of all the collective bargaining agreements. It will concern a vast majority of the Swedish workforce and will impact even companies without collective bargaining agreement, because the salary raise will be sort of a standard level for all companies. Secondly, we are all waiting for the first court decisions on the new legislation, the new legal grounds for termination, and to see, did the language we implemented on 1st of October really have a practical impact on the possibilities and the grounds for terminating an employment relationship. And finally, whistleblowing for the medium-sized company will enter into force on December 17. So you'd better prepare for the Christmas vacation this year and have it all introduced already.
If you don't want to ruin your Christmas vacation, Fredrik, of course. So that's a good tip for our listeners today. Closing remark for you, Tommy, and Finland. What would be your predictions?
Well, after busy 2020, we only have small employment law changes entering into force this year in Finland. But as I mentioned earlier, the current strike situation related to the salary negotiations may be by far the most substantial matter for the whole year in Finland. So what will be the outcome and when all those open collective agreements are signed again and we have industrial peace? That's to be seen. From the legal side, I would say that the coming changes in the discrimination legislation may cause the biggest impact in Finland, as it also will give the Equality Ombudsman the authority to supervise and investigate equality claims at workplace. Basically, earlier this authority was only with the Industrial Safety District, so it's interesting to see how the practice will develop after the changes take place.
Thank you for this final comment, Tommy. We'll watch for that. I think it's always interesting to see that we see similar issues throughout various jurisdictions in Europe and particularly in the Nordic regions, even though each time we hear about specific similarities. And I did hear, for example, that collective bargaining in your Nordic jurisdiction, at least in Sweden and Denmark, is certainly a topic to be watched out. So thank you to all of you. This is all the time we have today to cover all those year in review topics. So thanks to you, Tina, Tommy, Frederick, and Frederick for sharing your insights and your views about the various hot topics you were willing to discuss for your respective jurisdictions, that is Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden as part of this special ELA Year in Review podcast. It was a pleasure chatting to the four of you today.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you for hosting this interesting podcast.
You're welcome. And thank you as well to all our listeners who tuned in today. I hope this program has been insightful for you as it has been for myself. If you would like to connect with Tina, Tommy, or either of the two Fredericks, please click on their bios in the description of this podcast. We also encourage you to reach out to any of our lawyers around the world by selecting Find a Lawyer on the ELA website at ela.law, that's L-A-W. Information about all the programs available in the 2023 Year in Review series can be accessed in the notes of this podcast. You've been listening to the Year in Review Regional Roundtable, a series brought to you by the Employment Law Alliance, the world's largest network of labor and employment lawyers from the best law firms around the globe. I'm Philippe Durand. Thanks for listening.